So again, good morning, and thank you so much for joining us today for the third and final day of the As One Leadership Summit. Today we have Nicole Morgan from the Office of International Students and Scholars joining us. My name is Holly Mays. I use she, they pronouns, and I work for the Department of Associated Students as the Assistant Director of Governmental Affairs, and I'm here to help support and moderate today's session. But before we hand it over to Nicole, I want to introduce and give some space for your Internal Vice President, B. Schaefer.
Hello, everyone. Good morning. I'm B. Schaefer, and I wanted to say on behalf of the AS President, EVPLA, and Student Advocate General, I would like to welcome you all to the Intercultural Awareness and Communication Strategies training session. The following curriculum supports our vision for the 2021-2022 academic year and the knowledge we find essential for the association as we start fall quarter. Disclaimer is that please note that these training sessions are a portion of the information you will be required to learn as per legal code. Please take this time to be an active participant by engaging with your fellow peers. We look forward to serving you. Thank you all. And I'll pass it to Nicole.
Thank you, Bea. It's nice to see you all today. Thank you for being here. We're going to discuss on today's presentation intercultural awareness and communication strategies. So as mentioned, let me get my PowerPoint going, sorry. As mentioned, my name is Nicole Morgan. I use she, her pronouns. I work in the Office of International Students and Scholars. We're located on the third floor of the SRB, so we really encourage that you guys come up and visit us anytime you can. We're an active resource for all of campus, but obviously we serve the international student population. And so I want to begin today. We're going to, kind of show you the overview here. So we had our speaking agreement. We did our introductions, and then we're going to go over the theoretical framework for understanding culture, barriers to effective communication tips, and tools for effective communication. We hope to cover all this today. And at the end of this training, we hope you have a better understanding of cultural dimensions and leave with some tools to help understand and respect other cultures. So I want to start off kind of have you guys tell me that what you think of when you hear the word culture, what comes to your mind? And feel free to shout it out because I probably won't see your hand if you raise it. So what comes to your mind when you hear culture? Anyone? Surya? Go ahead. And like I said, just shout it out.
Like identity.
Very good. Thank you. That's a great example. Anyone else? I'm sure you all know.
Food.
Thank you. Good job. Okay. So those are two really good examples. Thank you. Now, just to give more of a definition, we're using Spencer Odie's definition, which is culture is a fuzzy set of basic assumptions and values, orientations to life, beliefs, policies, procedures, and behavioral conventions that are shared by a group of people. So that kind of encompasses everything, right? To break it down a little bit further, we're going to talk about two different subgroups of culture, which is culture-specific knowledge versus cultural general knowledge. Does anyone know what this is? Is anyone familiar with this? With cultural general or cultural specific knowledge, just to kind of gauge where people are at? Okay. Never seen before? Okay, so cultural specific knowledge refers to particular characteristics that belong generally to members of a certain culture, though not necessarily to every individual within that culture. Whereas cultural general knowledge is concerned with dimensions or frameworks that can be used to describe and compare all cultures. So a few identifiable dimensions are how cultures communicate or show emotions or relate to time would be considered under the general knowledge of culture. While cultural specific knowledge may help you understand a specific culture a little better, the general cultural general knowledge will help you understand and relate more deeply to the cultural differences when you encounter them. So we'll keep those two kind of things in mind as we go along through this presentation. And kind of an example of this is the cultural iceberg. So a lot of times when we interact or are learning about other cultures, most of what we know and understand is very surface level. So that's why it's referred to like an iceberg, because the larger dimension of culture that most people identify with is much deeper, meaning it's something that you don't see and that you won't notice just by looking or interacting maybe directly with that culture. It's kind of the unsaid things. So when we think of surface level culture, we're thinking about food, flags, music, holidays, games, arts and crafts, literature, language. Those are all things that someone from the outside culture can look at another culture and kind of identify with them. But a lot of people would say that their culture goes deeper than that. There are things like when you talk about communication and style and rules, there's facial expressions, gestures, eye contact, things that one culture might understand between each other, but you as an outsider maybe won't understand if you see it. And same with concepts of self and time, past and future. The differences in attitudes towards elder, adolescents, dependence, expectations. So all those things are deeper, that when we meet someone from another culture that's different to our own, we can't necessarily just see. And we might even be oblivious to it when we're interacting in that culture. And then another good way to think about culture is by looking at Geert Hofstede's Cultural Dimensions. And it's actually a really fascinating read. I do encourage you all to take a look. We have the QR code there that can take you to the article if you're interested. But Hofstede's model, he has a model of national culture that consists of 6 dimensions. The cultural dimensions represent independent preferences for one state of affairs over another that distinguishes countries rather than individuals from each other. So one of the examples I like to highlight here is the notion of individualism versus collectivism. Individualism can be defined as a preference for a loosely knit social framework in which individuals are expected to care of only themselves and their immediate families. So when we think of the US, we're very much an individualistic culture because we relate it's about ourselves, and we think about how we can strive for the better for ourselves. Its opposite, though, would be collectivism, which represents a preference for a tightly knit framework in society in which individuals can expect their relatives or members of a particular in-group to look after them in exchange for unquestioning loyalty. So a society's position of this dimension is reflected in whether people's self-image is determined in terms of I or we. So like I mentioned, Americans, we're very much I related. When we talk about our culture, we're usually talking about ourselves, whereas in other cultures around the globe that are collective, they're talking about the we, they're caring about the whole of that culture. They're acting for the betterment of that whole culture rather than just trying to prioritize themselves. So I have kind of an example, and I want to see if you guys can guess, get an idea of that kind of relates to US culture. There's something happening right now, actually, that exemplifies where the US sides in this dimension. There's this thing, an action that many US citizens can do that experts feel would contribute to the greater good and health of the nation. However, there's also many US citizens who would prefer and even refuse to do this thing because they prioritize their individual rights. The I outweighs the we. Does anyone know what this thing is that I'm referring to? Yes, Garrett, you're saying getting vaccinated or wearing a mask in public. That's correct. So when we think about what's happening right now in the world with the COVID pandemic, a lot of cultures, maybe cultures that are used to wearing masks on a regular basis, the mask dimension hasn't been necessarily an issue because they see it as protecting the greater good. It's something that they all need to do. Where in America right now, where we, very much identify as individuals, there are some Americans that feel it's infringing on that individual right. And so it's necessarily the I culture comes out here. So I thought that was a good example of that. And then of course, with Hofstede's cultural dimensions, there's the 5 other dimensions are the masculinity versus femininity, uncertainty, avoidance. So there's all these different ways that we interact and act throughout our day and with others within our culture. And I do really, like I said, encourage you all to go ahead and read this, because I think it'll give you a really interesting perspective when you're thinking about interacting and working with not even just students from other countries, but even just different states, different towns. Like this really encompasses everything. So have a look, although he is specifically talking about nations here when he's making these dimensions. Okay, so moving on, I want to touch on the barriers to effective and meaningful cross-cultural and intercultural communication. So there are a lot of stereotypes when we're talking about other cultures, and they're often based in cultural and political xenophobia and ignorance. And it perpetuates this kind of them versus us mentality. And it can put obviously a barrier between you and that other culture. Ethnocentrism is the evaluation of other cultures according to preconceptions originating in the standard and custom of one's own culture. So this is something we want students to avoid, to think more about ethnocentrism and how we can stay away from it. So when we're interacting with someone from a different country or a different place, it's helpful to avoid using cultural specific and cultural centered references. Not everyone is familiar with Schitt's Creek or The Mandalorian or Black Puma. So it can sometimes, when you're interacting with an international student, you're trying to get to know them. If you're bringing up references from shows that are culturally specific to the US, it's going to be hard for them to participate in that conversation because they may not have seen that. They don't know what it is. And then they already are kind of feeling like an outsider. So when you're meeting maybe somebody from another country, it's kind of always best to kind of ask to get to know them as well, ask about their culture, give them that in, rather than trying to discuss something that they may not be able to be familiar with, they may not be able to participate with. So it's really helpful to be mindful of that when interacting with other international students. And then tools for effective and meaningful cross-cultural and intercultural communication. We want to highlight self-reflection and humility are key to cross-cultural communication. So, think about yourself in this position. Maybe some of you have studied abroad, you know what it's like to be the outsider in another country or even in another part of the US. And just kind of reflect on that when you're interacting with a student and something that they're doing seems different or you're not understanding. Just kind of reflect on that when you're interacting, and be patient, listen to understand and learn, and speak to be understood. So be mindful of pace, slang, and cultural specific references, which I touched on. But definitely when we talk, when you're speaking, and this isn't to say that you need to talk slower or louder, because that's never helpful in any situation, but it's just be mindful that, the English language and all of the international students coming to UCSB are more than capable in understanding English and speaking English, and that's why they're at a higher institution education. But just being mindful that maybe the slang word you're using, or that you're talking faster, and that it could be hard to follow along. So just be mindful of those things when you're communicating. And like I said, put yourself in their shoes and look for the common ground. There's always common ground when interacting with anyone from anywhere, and there's always something you can connect on. So, always look for that common ground. And remember, the world is vast. We all have lots to learn. So just seek to learn from each other when interacting, and have fun with it. And so for us, in terms of the Office of International Students and you all as AS members, one thing we really would like you guys to focus on is that thought in your mind are you a global Gaucho ally? And what does that mean to be a global Gaucho ally? How can you help international students on campus as AS representatives? And so for us, a big part of that is reciprocate. Culture is an exchange. It's a two-way street. International students are here to learn about American culture and share about their own culture. So another way to get them involved or make them feel a part of campus is to ask about their cultures and learn from them. And in that natural exchange would happen. Advocate, attend international student events, meet with international orgs, and learn about issues unique to the international campus community. There are so many cultural orgs on campus, but it would be great if we could see more AS representatives there meeting with these orgs, asking them what their issues are, and kind of hearing right from the source. We have the International Student Advisory Board, which is a board on campus that's here to help international students and kind of bridge that gap. We're constantly trying to come up with ways, and we'd love to work with you all if you're interested in finding ways to make campus an easier and bridge that gap for international students. But we do see your role as helping to advocate for them. But first it takes taking the time to understand and learn about what those needs are, because they are in many ways different to domestic student issues, but not always. And then educate. Share the mission and goals of AS and encourage international students to participate. So one thing that we've learned is that international students don't always have an understanding of what student government or AS is or how it works, and therefore they don't participate. So that's another reason why attending, or going to different orgs on campus and kind of explaining what you do and getting other international students involved in that way would be so helpful, because a lot of students, the concept of student government doesn't exist in their country. They don't even know how to get involved to begin with, but that's not to say that they don't want to be involved. So it really takes, you guys advocating and being present with international students in all various aspects of campus to encourage them to get involved. And I'm really excited that we have 2 international senators this year, and that's awesome, but we could definitely have more. And I think it just takes, being out there and meeting with students regularly and going to these events. So before I go on, does anyone have any questions? Anything about what I've touched upon so far? Okay, I don't see any questions. So I'm going to summarize then. Basically what we touched on is, and our hopes for you guys as senators and interacting with the international student community is increasing awareness and understanding of our own characteristic ways of making meaning and acting in familiar and unfamiliar context. Increasing awareness and understanding of others' ways of making meaning and acting in familiar and unfamiliar contexts. Engaging mindfully in contexts that disorient or challenge us, and bridging cultural gaps in those contexts. So shifting perspectives, attuning emotions, and adapting our behavior in effective and appropriate ways. So again, similar to that 4-phrase approach in the intercultural learning by Hofstede. And questions. So that's really all I had for you guys today. I know it was brief, and there's definitely a lot more we can do. We would encourage, like I said, for all of you to come to OISS if you ever have questions or concerns, or want to be a part of anything. We're here for you. But I'd be happy to answer any questions you might have. Is that it? And that is that concludes my presentation. So if we don't have any questions, thank you so much for your time. I appreciate you all being here. And again, if you do want to follow up and you do have questions, I can put my email in the chat, and feel free to email me anytime.